No es problema, vamos a empezar con el micrófono en mano. Gracias, gracias, gracias. Es hora de la última charla plenaria de la PyConES, justo antes de la clausura. Muy bien, sois un público maravilloso. Está con nosotros Lorena Mesa, que es una de las directoras de la Python Software Foundation y ha hecho un largo viaje desde Chicago hasta aquí, así que por favor un fuerte aplauso. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Her talk will be in English, so all yours.
Perfect. Okay, so I am pretty loud, so I just want to get a thumbs up. How is this distance for the microphone? Thank you, I appreciate it. Okay, cool. So let's get right into it. Just some notes. I do have the slides available if you want to look at them. I link to every single thing that I talk about. If for some reason something isn't accessible or there's a missing link or I reference a paper that I forgot to cite, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I'm more than happy to make sure I get those resources to you, since this is a topic I'm very passionate about. So without further ado, now is better than ever. What the Zen of Python can teach us about data ethics. So, hola, soy Lorena. And I'm here today because this is a topic that is actually resonates a lot with my professional background, and I will talk a little bit about that. But this topic, I think we are seeing a lot of things happening in the world around us, and I really think it's important that we pause, give space to some of the ethical challenges that we're confronting, and making sure we're continuing this conversation and moving the ball forward. So a little bit about some of my background and things I do. So as was mentioned, I come from Chicago, Illinois, in the United States, where the weather is not as nice as it is here in Malaga. It is really not as nice. But in Chicago, a lot of the things that I've done over the years, really for me, issues that are important include getting more people who don't look like me and getting more people who don't look like me into tech and other underrepresented minorities. So be it diversity and inclusion work, be it thinking about political kind of movements in the United States. I've kind of worn a few hats during my career. So I run PyLady Chicago. That chapter's now over 3 years. We've had over 54 events, over 1,000 folks on Meetup, and we're going strong. We do a lot of work in Chicago thinking about what does diversity and inclusion look like. So we started a group called Chicago Tech Diversity Initiative, which is a Slack community that has space for all different types of groups doing work around diversity and inclusion in tech. And then that way we don't have N+1 Slacks to participate in. And then I do some things with a cool thing called the Python Software Foundation as a director. So all of this journey started during my time working on both Obama campaigns and then following my boss to actually work in the White House for a bit. So when it comes to ethics, I really look at it from the lens of applied social science research, and it really does inform a lot of the work that I do actively in Python open source. So the elephant in the room. Why in the world should we care about data ethics? And that is a really great question, and I think one that's a little bit complex to answer. One way we can think about it is we can just simply sit and think about how much data is being consumed on a daily basis. So this is a stat that I have used before, but my last figure I had was from 2012 from a BBC Business article, wherein the stat said every day there's 2.5 gigabytes of new data generated daily in 2012. Now, sitting here looking at March 2018, we have 2.5 quintillion records of new data generated daily. We are literally swimming in data. We are creating so much data. It's around us. We're recording everything. What are we doing with it all? So not only are we creating a lot of data, but also the ways in which we capture that data is changing, and we have new mechanisms to do it that weren't available to us perhaps even 5 or 10 years ago. So one way we can think about data collection is we can think about the means in which data is collected. We can think about data collection as an active process or as a passive process. For example, as an active process, when you're interacting with your subject, you're actually going to your subject, maybe you're a user who uses your software, and you're saying, hey, I have a survey, fill this out for me. So there's an active relationship there. But increasingly, we have these passive mechanisms of data collection where we don't have to actually have interaction with the subject in order to collect information about the subject. So what does that actually mean when it comes to some of the practices that we have here, be it you're a web developer, be it you're a data scientist, or maybe you're in academia? Well, we can think about web tracking technologies. We can think about that as cookies. We can think about it as GPS. I know that my phone keeps telling me, hey, Lorena, did you know that this app is still using your location in the background? And I'm like, oh, I guess it is. So GPS. We have chatbots. So an example of this may be when you are purchasing something online, perhaps people participate and buy things through Etsy, which is a collection of independent shops where you can buy cool crafts and furniture and all the things. If you are curious about perhaps where your package is because you bought something on Etsy and you're like, hey, I haven't received it for a week or two, maybe that Etsy shop has a Facebook page. If you were to go start a dialogue with that shop on Facebook, it's likely that they may use a chatbot to collect information and start automating that data collection process. So this is another way we can think about it. Additionally, there's social media monitoring and listening. There's also then things like passive measurements like anything that's in the health industry. So I'm guilty of it. I wear a Fitbit all the time. Actually, I'm a big runner, so I love my Fitbit. But with Fitbits, I don't know if you saw the graphic that was circulating earlier this year, but based on the movements of folks in the United States that wear Fitbits, they were actually able to create a visualization showing where all of the military bases in the United States are. So passive data collection. In the aggregate, new things we can do. Additionally, then transactional data. For example, retail programs like in the United States, big retailers is something named Walgreens, and they have a key fob where anytime you go in and purchase, or actually really any retail store, they say, hey, can I have your phone number? Hey, can I have your email? They're creating profiles on you, whether you're aware of it or not. So not only are we generating a lot of data, but we have a lot of ways in which we can collect that data, and a lot of it is happening perhaps in ways we may not fully understand or be aware of. Then let's think about patterns of use. So I remember a time when I did not have a cell phone and none of the smart devices were things that existed. I think that might be why I can kind of still get around without Google Maps, but that my ability to do that has greatly diminished. But I can remember a time when I did not have access to the internet. I would have to go to the public library in Chicago for that. And that's very much a different experience for young people today. So if we're thinking about, not only are we generating a lot of data, collecting data in new ways that may or may not be obvious, but also the patterns of how we as people are going online and actually interacting with software that may be collecting our data is changing quite quickly. In a May 2013 study from BBC, they surveyed families basically talking about how do you understand your child using the internet. Of the families surveyed, about 3/4 of the parents believed that their children were spending only about an hour online each day, wherein those same children that were surveyed, where their parents said about an hour, 2/3 of them said, well, actually, I'm spending about 2 hours a day online. So already there's a disparity behind the perception of how much time we're spending online. And this part is the part that kind of pulls my heartstrings a bit. In that same survey, when they're talking about how people are getting online, they were talking about what is your experience like online as a child. Parents, when surveyed, were highly unaware that their children were having negative experiences online. In this survey, about 2/3 of the children surveyed said they at least had a few negative experiences online, whereas only 22% of the parents surveyed had some understanding that their children were encountering conflict or negativity online. So younger population getting online, more and more time online. What that experience looks like, we already now have disparities. Is it a safe experience or not? Lots of data, new ways to collect. So all these things, to me, start saying, okay, well, I don't know, should we be very terrified of the modern world? Is it all really that bad? Well, I mean, I guess the internet's great because we have all these like cat photos online. And as a total cat woman, and yes, I do have a cat scarf on today, I mean, we have all kinds of data available online. CNN estimated that there's about 6.5 billion cat pictures on the internet as of 2015, with about 2 million cat videos on YouTube with an average view count of 12,000. So, I mean, I guess not all the data online is bad, but the fact that we even have that much cat stuff online, that just says something. But jokes aside, and in all seriousness, the thing that I'm trying to communicate to you is that our relationship with the internet is fundamentally changing the social fabric of our communities. It's changing my relationship with you all because I'm increasingly talking to people through the internet. So how we interact, how we meet people. I've met a lot of people through Python mailing lists that maybe I would not have otherwise met. So all that to say that the data that we're generating and collecting, coming from the internet and the way that we encounter and experience the world, we need to really be thinking about the impact and what that does for us. So some notes that I want to pause and talk about before I get into the heart of this conversation. First of all, this is not meant to be the answer for how we talk about data ethics. Instead, it's meant to be a conversation. It's meant to help provide a framework for how you can think about ethics in your technical practices. And part of the way that we're going to be doing that is we need to actually dig in deep and observe the world around us. That means I'm going to be talking about some heavy topics. So I just want to check in and say to you, some of the topics I'm going to dig into may for some people be a little sensitive. Please feel free, if you need to stand up, go outside. I fully respect your decision, and I want you just to be mindful of where you're at with things, because we are living in a world where there's a lot of things that are happening, and I'm going to be digging into some of that. Cool? Okay, so at the end of this conversation, ultimately what I wanted to think about is how can we move the needle in the right direction? What are some tangible things we can do to start thinking about our technical practices as it relates to data ethics? So the name of this talk makes reference to the Zen of Python, and I think any new Pythonista, at some time or another, they are introduced to, hey, do they import this? And then you get this poem, this set of aphorisms, and you're kind of like, okay, that's cool, but what is this? Well, as we probably all know in this room, the Zen of Python was introduced with the Python Enhancement Proposal, PEP for short, PEP 20 in 2004, and is written by Tim Peters. The thing that I like about the Zen of Python, and I think something that is really, really fun and why people really embrace this, is because when we talk about what Python code is, what makes it good, what makes it bad, we can make reference to this kind of cutesy poem, and this poem allows us to kind of have aphorisms, not strict rules, but aphorisms, suggestions for how we write and create good Python code. Or to make reference to Kenneth Reit's Hitchhiker's Guide to Python. Basically, again, it's not that the Zen of Python is pontificating the way to write Python, but instead invites you to have a dialogue when you're talking with other people about what is good Pythonic code. And so for that reason, I really like some of the lighthearted but concise and at times intentionally vague aphorisms that come out of the Zen of Python, and I think that it's something that we can take and also apply to data ethics. So let's go ahead and get into it. So complex is better than complicated. So first thing we probably want to do is think about what in the world is data ethics and where does this term come from? There's a few ways we can think about this. We can think about it as the language of what's right or what's wrong. We can think about it as our rights and responsibilities. We can think about it as something else. Luckily, I'm gonna actually use a definition that was introduced in Philosophical Transactions in 2016 that'll help us think about ethics, because what it may mean in your practice for data ethics may be very different for me than it is for you. So I like this three-pronged approach because it allows us to have enough kind of meat to dig into where it's at least applicable to you in some way, shape, or form. So when we think about data ethics for the purpose of this talk, I want us to think about it in three parts. The ethics of data, that is how data is generated, recorded, and shared. The ethics of algorithms, that is how is AI, machine learning, how are the robots, how are they interpreting data? And then lastly, the ethics of practices. That is, how are we designing responsible professional codes to help guide the emerging science of data science, machine learning, whatever word you use for it in your practice. If we were thinking about a kind of a classic machine learning problem where financial forecasting, if I were to say, okay, write me an algorithm that is going to be able to do forecasting around explicit types of stocks, what that performance is going to be in the future, likely you're going to say, okay, well, what data do we have available? You might say, okay, I need access to the historical ledger that shows the past 3 years so that I can get trends, because maybe you're trying to understand the impact of climate change on how certain green technologies are doing in the world. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but you would be asking for some obvious data sets to begin with. Now, the thing that would be kind of interesting is if I said, okay, well, I want you to focus from 2000 forward, but then I don't give you any other data except for the data that's actually recording the stock market price when the market's open and when the market's closed, and you notice that there's this blip perhaps around September 11th, 2001. You might not be clear why there's a blip. And this is just to go to show that, as many of us probably know, in the United States, there was an act of terrorism on September 11th, 2001. So when we're thinking about how data creates a snapshot for us, we need to be thinking about not only the data we have, but the data we don't have. Because there is a relationship there, and that's going to be something that we keep coming back to. What is present in the record and what is not? I thought this was really interesting. So on your Twitter profile, you can go and get information around, like, what does social media think you are? So apparently, well, I'm a woman. My language is English, and I really like my age range, because apparently I'm 13 to 54 and/or greater than 65. So apparently I'm not someone who hangs out with. For some reason, I'm not 55 to 64, so I don't understand what that means for my age. But again, kind of when we're thinking about data sets, the other thing too is not only the absence of data, but also inconsistent labeling, things like that. And I just thought that was really interesting when I went and dug into my Twitter profile just to see who Twitter thinks I am. So a prominent data scientist that we may have heard about is Cathy O'Neil. She wrote a great publication called Weapons of Math Destruction that I highly encourage you to check out. But something I want to highlight here that Cathy presents to us is really this idea that big data processes codify the past. The data that we collect becomes the ground truth that we use when we're creating algorithms, and from those algorithms automating away decisions. The thing that Cathy O'Neil then challenges people to think about is, okay, if big data codifies the past, where then do we step in as technologists and make moral decisions? Where are we putting our foot down to talk about fairness or to talk about transparency and other such things? She's very intentional in saying that we need to, at times as technologists, go ahead and put fairness ahead of profit. So when we're thinking about big data, these themes are going to continue to emerge around not only what is recorded, but what isn't recorded, and also how there's redundancy and problems with data collection itself. And it starts with the collection itself. Another way we can think about this, and this comes from participatory culture and the new governance of communication, the paradox of participatory media, we can think about how it is, again, algorithms are essentially automating away decisions, right? Or automating away decisions, or helping us automate things that maybe have a lot of input and no one human could shift through. So when we're thinking about the practice of algorithms, literally, quite literally, our algorithms today are sorting between noise and signal, and they are literally making decisions to say, this has meaning, this doesn't have meaning, and this is sensible and this isn't. Our algorithms are literally creating the world around us and telling us what we should pay attention to and what we shouldn't. So that's all cool and dandy, but how does this conversation actually impact me directly? Well, as I mentioned, I started my career, I do not have a computer science degree. I actually went to school for undergrad for political science and mathematics. And during that time, I started working on the first Obama campaign in Chicago. So Arianna Huffington, I think, sums it up pretty well when she says, President Obama would not have been president had it not been for the internet. Had it not been for the internet, President Obama wouldn't have even been the nominee. So what exactly does that mean? Well, let me tell you, the political campaign of President Obama was groundbreaking. Something new that was happening there that perhaps today we would look back and have a little bit of a pause is thinking about how political campaigns themselves are fundamentally executed and are run in the United States and also elsewhere. One of the things that was groundbreaking about this campaign was its use of social media, For example, having town halls, that is where you might go to a small town, invite some people to come in and kind of do a Q&A forum with them, but having town halls on YouTube and having live, like, almost ask me anythings on Twitter with your population that you're trying to engage with. So the use of social media was quite profound. Additionally, then the data coming from our use of social media was informing our strategies that we were using for the campaign. At the time, we were doing something we didn't really understand, which predated or was contemporary with the development of the word data science, but quite literally, the data that we were getting from all these new technologies was informing our strategies. For example, informing our get out the vote, GOTV strategies, and thinking about how we can meet people where they're at, where they're not at. This all spun into the customized fill-in-the-blank anything for Obama. If you were to probably do a Google image for Obama for America campaigns, there were so many stickers where it's Latinos for Obama, LGBTQ for Obama. I think there was veterans for Obama. There's quite a few. But this idea here, the personalized idea of let's personalize the presidential campaign to hear your voice and amplify your voice. That's what this campaign was doing, and it was doing it by using new technologies, pulling in those new technologies to create new data sets that weren't previously available so that we could interact with this population. I'm sure many of us have seen the Venn diagram of data science. It has to be in any talk where you talk about data science, I think. But the idea of like data science where you have, you're drawing from computer science, math, subject area expertise, and then somehow in the middle you have this data scientist. In the way we were drawing from the campaign, it was interesting because we were pulling in a lot of people who may not have been such an integral part in historical presidential campaigns, because there was a growth in the folks that were technologists in this campaign. So pulling those folks in to really make this data science strategy work for the Obama campaign was instrumental in the success of both campaigns. And just to kind of put it into perspective, DJ Patil, who was the former chief data scientist under President Obama, and Jeff Hammerbacher, around 2008, 2010, started coining this term data science. Who actually coined it? There's a lot of debate about this. I'm just gonna quote this O'Reilly's article and say that around 2008, around 2010 is when this term starts popping up, and it's actually in 2012 that you get a Wikipedia page for data science. So it's interesting, right? We have simultaneously this new branding, this new fun, exciting political campaign that's making use of all of these new technologies, and it's using this thing called data science, and we're all just like, this is great. But the thing is, I think like anything that we get excited about with all the buzzwords in tech is there's a lot of mythology with what data science can and cannot do, with what any new exciting thing in tech can and cannot do. So one myth, like the one data scientist who's the unicorn, well, yeah, sorry, that doesn't really exist, but there might be people who are very close to it. I thought this was kind of funny, that a data scientist is a person who's better at stats than any software engineer and better at software engineering than any statistician. I don't know. I'll leave you all to decide that. But that's to say that the Obama for America campaign, which I will argue has had such a heavy-handed impact in the last 10 years in the shape of politics in the United States and subsequently around the world, data science was front and center, and we were using brand new technologies like social media to make this thing happen. But we never really questioned the use of social media. I don't know, maybe we should have. This is, I think, where we start getting into some of the nitty-gritties of what is happening in the world today. So, first example, special cases aren't special enough to break the rules. Censorship and cyberbullying in social media. I'm just going to pause and let you take this in. These are all article snapshots from last year. And we're going to dig into some of these. And if you would like to read some of these on your own, these are all linked back to the articles if you would like to dive into them yourselves. I think this is just a snippet of some of the complexities and some of the ethical challenges that we're confronting. And social media is a big place where we're seeing a lot of these things unfold. So I'm going to go ahead and step into this a little further. So if you aren't familiar with the Me Too movement, #MeToo, Essentially, it's a movement talking about sexual assault and what's happening in the world around people sharing their stories who are survivors of sexual assault. So Rose McGowan is a Hollywood actress who was speaking about her experience with Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein, and in sharing her experience on social media, people noticed that her account had gotten blocked and was no longer on Twitter. And people were very, very confused. What's happening? Why isn't Rose McGowan still on Twitter? What's going on there? And this conversation thread is coming from Twitter Safety, explaining why the actress's Twitter account had been temporarily suspended. Explicitly, it goes into terms of service, because apparently a private information, such as a phone number, was shared by the actress, and that goes against terms of service, so Twitter said, no, we're gonna shut this down. Now, if you were to think about that as censorship, how do we process this? So the conversation that popped up here when we're thinking about social media, this is August 2017. The last was in the Rose McGowan incident is October 2017, so just about a year ago. And with the snippet here, a lot of people are pointing out, hey, the language of a person who runs a country in the highest seat in a country, why is it that that their language is incendiary? It can cause an armed conflict. What is happening here? And there was a lot of concern around how censorship was being applied to some and not to others. So to hark back to Cathy O'Neill, something that we start seeing when we start observing ethical conflicts, let's say, in the world around us, is we start seeing this pattern emerge. The privilege we'll see time and again are processed more by people, the masses by machines. So in digging into this a little bit more, if we're thinking about censorship in social media, one question we can ask is, whose speech is subjected to censorship and why? What does censorship mean? And is automation the new tool of oppression? The examples given here just highlight how the experience of censorship on technology platforms like Twitter, how they can inspire global conversations and can have very different meanings for the people who are participating in them and the people who are receiving them. So when we talk about social media, social works quite differently across all platforms. So if we talk about Reddit, in Reddit we have basically anonymous users who choose a screen name. They do not have to go through a verification process. You have subreddits, which are governed by a moderator, and how the moderator moderates that community is variable across communities. So the experience then, if we were trying to say, I want to write an algorithm to flag problematic content or to enforce some kind of standards of censorship, the way that I would approach writing it for understanding Reddit would be highly different than the way I would do if I was doing it for Twitter, where we might actually have some more information available, but granted, Twitter's a completely open global forum. Wikipedia, by the way, when I say Wikipedia as a social media space, is because for people who create pages on Wikipedia, they actually have discussion pages where other users can come in and on your page, your user page, say, hey, I saw that edit you made to this page, that's correct or not. And actually, there's a big corpus called the Detox Project that scraped a bunch of this data and actually has a lot of interesting things to say about measuring toxicity. But it is for the purpose of saying we have a space where we can meet people online to communicate, we can say it's social. So again, all of these spaces are quite different. So if we were now to step into, maybe not censorship, but we're thinking about cyberbullying, this definition comes from the Canadian Center for Cyberbullying, and it basically says when we think about cyberbullying, some of the things we can highlight about it is essentially that it's deliberate, it's repeated, and there's hostile behavior. Hostile behavior directed towards an individual or to a group with the intent to harm. So the idea here, some things we can easily quantify may be the intentionality, the repetition, and that it might be targeting the same person or group moment after moment. But if I were to think about how I would actually build that out, some of the things we need to think about is, well, what's the actual question I want to answer? One thing could be, do I want to actually identify the offender? That is, do I want to see if there's a troll that's on social media? Another way that I could think about writing an algorithm to respond to this question would be actually identifying instances of cyberbullying. So for example, I could say, what's the likelihood a conversation is cyberbullying? Is this conversation aggressive or is it not? So we could do like sentiment analysis. And lastly, at what level is a conversation deemed cyberbullying? We can think about thresholds as well. So all this to show that this is a complicated question, and depending on the platform you're on, and depending on what your end goal is, we can go about doing this in quite a few ways. Historically, the way that social media platforms have done this is with content moderation via the product owner or from user feedback. So for user feedback, if you're on, let's say, Facebook, you can click and flag something and then give a category for saying why you think this content is problematic. Which leads us into actually how it's happening today. So Facebook has 7,500 content moderators. They have more than 1 billion posts a day, and more than 10 million posts a day are flagged as problematic. That is a huge problem. With the way then censorship, cyberbullying, detecting cyberbullying happens in social media, using Facebook as an example, if we were to dig in even deeper into some of the decisions and some of the ethical challenges this presents, with Facebook, essentially the way that they do it is they think about protected classes. So in the space of Facebook, what is considered a protected class? That would be categories like sex, race, religious affiliation, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, serious disability, or disease. So those are considered their protected categories. And then we have unprotected categories, which include social class, occupation, continental origin, political ideology, appearance, religion, age, or country. So the way that they think about it is they say, okay, if content has been flagged, we need to understand if this content is actually talking about a protected class or an unprotected class. And based on if it's talking about a protected class or an unprotected class, it's either going to be removed, moderated, stripped from the platform, or not. And this is where we get into this. So this is actually from the ProPublica article that is linked in the previous slide, where Facebook moderators during their training, they have this example given to them. Which of the below subsets do we protect? Number 3, white men. So the way that works is, if you're thinking about black children, race is a protected class, but age is not, so it's a more specific subset, and because it's a more specific subset, therefore, it's an unprotected class, we're not gonna moderate it, we're done. Whereas white men, white being race, men being gender, both protected classes, if there's content that talks about, for example, all white men are bad, that would be an example of something that would be censored, whereas all black children are bad would not. So the ways in which these rules start to unfold get increasingly more complex, increasingly more difficult, and are basically just-in-time rule creations. The problem here is obviously scaling that up and obviously trying to understand each unknown case of something that can come your way. But with Facebook, this is where we're at currently. Another thing to think about, not only then do we have the challenges around how is content fed into your system to moderate, not only then do we think about the rules of arbitration for how moderation is done, but also let's talk about the impact on the moderators themselves. So there are some moderators who are formal employees of Facebook, there are some that are not. And if you're not a formal employee of Facebook, but a contractor, think about the things that you do not have access to. So if you work for Facebook, likely you have good health insurance. And if you have good health insurance, and in the United States, insurance is there's a big debate going on around how does insurance work. But if you don't have access to good health insurance and you are sitting 8 hours a day going through thousands of pieces of content, of which can be more disturbing than the next, and you have nothing to indicate to you what is coming next, you're just going through things that are coming your way, and you're like, yes, this is problematic, no, it isn't. I can't even begin to imagine the impact that has on mental health. And so then we then get even deeper into kind of the ethical challenge here, which is who are the people then that we decide protect our eyes? Who is expendable, who is not? And these are other things we have to think about as technologists when we're creating our solutions. So at the end of the day, we can say no one human or computer can sift through all social media and online communication. But I ask you this question. When we no longer can find enough humans to intervene, what do we risk? Errors should never pass silently. Predictive policing. So I'm from Chicago, and I'm going to be talking specifically about Chicago. So in 2017, Mayor Rahm Emanuel, rather than develop a strategy of hiring more police or thinking about something more comprehensive to deter increased crime that's happening in Chicago, the answer that Rahm proposed was to, let's not hire more officers or do more training or think about that, but instead, let's do something called predictive policing. Essentially meaning that we're going to be investing in software that does predictive policing. It feels very much like Minority Report, but this is something that has been a dialogue starting as of last year. And when we talk about what exactly is predictive policing, I'll give you some examples. So one way we can think about it is we want to be able to identify people who are expected to be victims and identify people who are the criminals. So the idea here, as was explained in the strategy, is that we want to be able to have officers go and visit someone even before they execute a violent crime to tell them, hey, you shouldn't do that. So what is a way that we can automate detection of possible criminality, possible criminals, and then proactively reach out to them to tell them, no, 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 don't do that. That was one of the ways they were trying to think about this problem. And one such way that was starting to unfold, there are researchers at Chicago's ITT that were trying to create an algorithm that would generate a score 1 to 500 plus to determine how risky, how much of a public safety threat that you posed. So the idea then is you generate this score, and then that score could be used by the Chicago Police Department or other bodies that are responding to incidents, and they can use that to help them in their policing strategy. One way that this was suggested to be used was to have the number pop up on the dash in a cop car if you are responding to an incident. You pull someone over so you know who you're dealing with. So again, the idea here, you get a number. That number is supposed to indicate if it's a higher number, that person's more likely to be violent, more likely to be a criminal, and that then is supposed to inform the police officer how to respond or what level of aggression to use when responding. The problem here is, if you are providing that information without saying, hey, this is the data that's fed into it, black box models are highly problematic, and obviously, this is not a good solution. So this just happened October 5th in Chicago. Justice for Laquan, so in late 2014, a young black man from Chicago, age 17, was shot 16 times, and ultimately died as a result of his wounds. The officer was put on trial, and just on 2 or 3 days ago, just on Friday, there we go, October 5th, the city of Chicago was able to say, hey, we brought someone to justice because the jury found the police officer to be guilty of second-degree murder. By the way, second-degree murder means he did not actually have a moment of misconduct as an officer. He was actually executing his duties as an officer completely fair, but he did kill someone, so we're gonna give him second degree. It is also additionally possible that he may not go to jail, so there's a lot of complexities here. But the thing here that I'm trying to highlight is that in Chicago, there are problems with public trust between underrepresented communities, specifically the black community in Chicago. And there are very, very, very real things showing that aggression is used more often to people of color more likely to men of color than it is to other communities. Another thing to consider is Chicago is actually a segregated city, not because we have signs that say, hey, this is where each kind of person can live, but it is the result of complex socioeconomic processes, where in the north side of Chicago, you have largely a white affluent population with access to amenities like public transportation, whereas the south side of Chicago is historically more black. And then in the middle, we kind of have the Latino population. So it is actually a city where if you say, okay, I want to start deploying predictive policing algorithms for use in the city, and I'm noticing that there's more criminals in specific parts of the city, it is very likely that that can be associated to over-policing to an explicit type of person in the city of Chicago. And so that's why when we talk about predictive policing, it is a very complex thing when we start thinking about how do we automate away decisions that can result in loss of life. Another thing that happened, City of Chicago had, the Chicago Police Department is being brought to court by ACLU. And for those of you who may not know what the ACLU is, they are an organization that basically listens around to make sure that constitutional rights of US citizens aren't being violated. And if they see issues where there's a constitutional violation of a citizen's rights, they will go and bring suit around these issues. So specifically, the Chicago Police Department is being called out for their use of social media tracking and monitoring software. For example, one of the named software providers in this brief is Geofeedia, where in their marketing materials, they explicitly said, with our software, you can find activists and unions and label them as threats. You can also create listening strategies using Media Sonar, another software provider, where you can specifically follow hashtags like Black Lives Matter, don't shoot, I'm unarmed, police brutality, it's time for change. So explicitly, these software providers are setting themselves up to say activists and unions are problematic. You can listen and follow these discussions that are happening online, and here's how you can do it with our software. So this is what the ACLU is digging into also with the city of Chicago. And if you haven't seen this, recognition with a K, because we're engineers and like to spell things in fun ways, Amazon released a facial recognition API earlier this year, where basically what you can do is upload images. It will say, hey, I'm going to try to match it to another image I have in my database. If I have it, cool. If not, no. But the problem here was the way that Amazon went about positioning the use of this API. Essentially, they said, okay, we've got a case study on our website where a law enforcement officer had written a use case saying, okay, this is how I went about doing it. I uploaded a data set of mugshots. I set it to 80% confidence, and then I'm good to go. I can start feeding in new images to see if we've got someone who has been arrested before, given the data that we have in our data set. The problem here then is, again, the ACLU brought this out and called out the problems with this, is when you upload the recommended data set, which is again a set of mugshots, they then fed in the images of members of the US Congress, and they found that there was a high level of misidentifications, of which there were 28. 11 of them were people of color, which is nearly 40%. Nearly 40% of those wrongly matched are in fact people of color. So we're finding that this software is actually more likely to incorrectly, given a set of mugshots, identify faces of color as being a person who has been arrested before. It's a misidentification, and the ACLU is pointing out that you're not actually training people how to properly use this, and you're going after law enforcement agencies. Amazon actually said, well, okay, it's not that we don't want people to use our software. We actually have a more detailed set of documentation where you shouldn't be using the 80% level, but you should be using the 95% level of confidence. And the dialogue then that continued to unfold was, if you are positioning that anyone can use your software, and this is how you do it, and you have a law enforcement agent who's using settings that you don't even yourself recommend to use and you're getting problems with misidentification, this is problematic and can have very real impact for law enforcement strategies around the world for whomever is using this. So again, just another thing we have to think about. So not only then are we having problems for the algorithms we're creating, but then also the education for how people can use the software that we provide for them. And then the last thing around predictive policing is just even the idea of how flawed at times facial recognition software is. This project on the right, CV Zazzle, shows not avant-garde hairstyles, but it shows ways in which you can actually prevent facial recognition from identifying your face properly just by doing simple things like changing your haircut, because often, for example, you'll have your hair pulled back from your face. What that means and how that looks may depend on the country of origin, gender, things like that, but that's what this project here is showing. Another thing too, the 1 pixel attack for fooling deep neural networks, because AWS started talking about what images you should use when you're doing facial recognition. If you just change one pixel in an image, you can have a fundamentally different outcome for what a deep neural network understands that image to be. So with mugshots, which are themselves problematic because they overrepresent historical biases of who is deemed to be a criminal and who is not deemed to be a criminal, and you're feeding that into facial recognition software, and there's problems with how you communicate to someone if you have a misidentification or not. We're just seeing layer upon layer upon layer of issues. So then to bring it back into the social media conversation, a lot of this dialogue around fake news, we've seen that there is then problems also with how platforms are trying to understand how news is shared within human networks. One way that this was dialogued about is around the influence of bots in such platforms such as Twitter. So with Twitter, the above article talks about how there was a shooting in 2017 on the UC Berkeley campus, and 2 students had created a project called botcheck.me to understand if a profile is a bot or not. Essentially what they found, they were focusing in on news being shared around the shooting on the campus, and they found that there were bots that were sharing articles saying that the person who they believed to be the shooter had recently converted to Islam, even though that is not correct. So in studying this, they found that if you go in a little bit deeper, you can see that there's not only just problems with how bots can disseminate falsities, but also what those falsities mean in the space of the topic that is being talked about. So this actually comes from the United States formal investigation into the influence of potential hacking by Russian hackers during the 2016 election. I thought it was just interesting because by no means am I saying that Django is problematic, but there was a handle, Jingle Magic Dev, that was apparently retweeting information that was false around the election. So it's interesting when you start digging into seeing like what is a bot, what isn't, what handles are chosen, what aren't. All of these things then bring us back just into the reality that when we have networks and ways of sharing information, time after time after time when we're doing these studies, we're finding that it's easier to spread falsities than it is to spread truth. And when we find how quickly this happens, we don't have a way to unroll that back. So when we're creating the technology to allow people to share information, share news, dialogue with one another, and we're not thinking about how to audit our systems or what that looks like, we can have very real implications where we can demonize a group, we can impact elections, we can do a lot of things that we may not have intended to do. With Facebook, this got so far as basically in Myanmar, Facebook is considered pretty much the place you go to be online to find content and to communicate with folks. Essentially, there was a series of articles being shared that is believed to have incited violence against a minority Muslim community in Myanmar, which led to actual violence, loss of life, and people having to flee for their lives and leave Myanmar. So all of that to say that now is better than never. We need to think about what we can do to change the game. After all, algorithms, as well as data, are shaped and designed by humans. So what that may mean. So some of the things that are happening that I would like to be hopeful about, there are groups that are having discussions around what it may mean to have something like a Hippocratic Oath for perhaps a data scientist to take. So on the left is the Hippocratic Oath, which is something that medical practitioners take to say, these are the values I uphold when I render medical services. What would that look like if we were to apply it in the space for data science or machine learning? And this is from the 2018 Undergraduate Perspective Interim Report from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Other groups that are thinking about this include the Association for Computing Machinery's Committee. So this is their third draft, and you can actually go pop onto the website to check this out. And there are other groups, such as this working group in Berlin, that are trying to propose the idea of something called critical engineering. In their listed items of action include such things such as bullet 7, which says the critical engineer observes the space between the production and consumption of technology. Acting rapidly to changes in the space, the critical engineer serves to expose moments of imbalance and deception. Bullet point 8 says the critical engineer looks to the history of art, architecture, activism, philosophy, and invention, and finds exemplary works of critical engineering. All this to say that this is a group that's intentionally trying to say we need to think about this, we need to think about the impact that our tools have, and we need to understand how to bring that into our build cycle, into our formal technology practices, so that we are aware of what's happening. We do have mechanisms in place to actually follow up and think more about this. In the United States, a big one that has popped up is Data for Democracy, which is a list a little bit of aphorisms, but this is something that's actively happening, and if you are interested, you can go check it out on GitHub, and there's also an active Slack. And if you would like to see other groups that are participating in these conversations, this Medium article has a list of all of the groups, mostly Western Europe and the United States, that are thinking about this conversation, such that if you're thinking about, okay, maybe I do want to bring something like this back to my space, back to my practice, you can go ahead and pop in and take a look at that. But that is not to say that the ethical code is supposed to be the only way that we respond to issues. For some people, this is not good enough and it's not doing enough. Such as Sean Wheeler of Elastis Digital basically saying, okay, we don't just need a list of things that we think are cool, that we think are good, we actually need to have skin in the game. We need to actually have something that holds us accountable. So what does that mean? And to draw from Sparrow founder Deborah Hanaus, some of the things that you can think about right now, you can think about this in 4 easy ways. Exploring and understanding your data, exploring your errors, making your results interpretable, and if you don't know something, find someone who knows more on that topic than you do. So some projects currently that you can follow if you are looking to contribute, if you are looking to use, if you're looking to follow these discussions. The Data Nutrition Project, this is coming from MIT Media Lab, and essentially what they're doing is they're trying to create tools that allow you to think about your data lineage. Where's your data coming from? Providing a set of quantitative and qualitative statistical measurements to help you unpack the archaeology of your data. Another kind of cool thing is they're trying to, like on a food product, come up with a design that would say, okay, what would be the nutritional label that we would use on data sets to help us understand what is in this data, what isn't in this data, things like that. Another project you can think about is Facets, which has a set of tools that you can use to explore your data that allows you to think about such things as unexpected feature values, missing feature values, training serving skew, and other such statistically significant measurements. And then lastly, for you, if you're perhaps not looking to contribute to a project that's already existing, maybe you want to do something a little bit different, maybe a formal training, a project you can bring back where you have a workshop, I'm going to encourage you to think about this. The Mozilla Foundation is on October 10th opening up this challenge to think about responsible computer science. Specifically, what would it mean if we were to bring an ethical curriculum or an investigation of ethics to computer science at the undergraduate level. The bids will be open until mid-December, so if you are thinking about that, please come talk to me. I'm actually helping with this project. But it is something that you can think about, and it is another way we can perhaps interact with this conversation if you're looking to do something here and now. And lastly, an easy thing you can do within your organization is just think about, quite simply, your data lifecycle. If you don't understand how your data gets collected from when it gets stored, initially created, then stored all the way to its destruction, that's one way you can start thinking about how the tools that you create, the tools that you're bringing into the world, where there's possible vulnerabilities and places where you can do more. So all that to say, at the end of the day, it's your turn. I really hope that, if anything, that this talk has gone over is to help you think a little bit about some of the challenges we're confronting and how these challenges have very, very real implications that can perpetuate historical systems of inequity, that can lead to actual loss of life, and that our silence means that we are complicit. So I would love for you all to think about what is the impact that you would like to make as a technologist. If you do want to continue this conversation, please, please, please do reach out to me. I am on Twitter. It is 4 O's. I would be more than happy to talk with you after this chat. And also, just as a shout out, some of the images I used come from WOC in Tech, Women of Color in Tech. If you're looking for another data set or another set of images that highlight an engineer that is not, that may not often be seen in the imagery that we use or we consume in the world around us, check them out. Thank you so much, I appreciate it. I did an hour.
Thank you very much. Then quick question. Okay, I have one. Sorry, no, there are more than one. Wait a second. This is for you.
Oh, that would make sense.
First of all, thanks very much. In general, I found the talk really interesting, everything that you covered. I was curious to know, as your background is more political, and my background is also a more political background. I was curious to know what your opinion is, coming from politics. To what extent do you feel like the onus falls on the state to, coming back to the social media, about the protected classes, who's a protected class, who's not a protected class, and everything that's happened this year in the Senate with the Facebook investigation and the general level of technological comprehension? To what extent do you think the onus should fall on the state to sort of help regulate these kind of biases and these kind of rights that were given as social media users, especially when you take into account, like, say, the what happened with Alex Jones recently, and how he's arguing as though it's a human right to be able to have access to social media? To what extent do you feel like the state should be able to have that kind of input? And if they have that input, to what kind of extent is it on us as technological people to help them form those opinions that then would eventually become law? Sorry, it's a bit of a long question.
No, that's a great question. In the United States, there was legislation that was passed called FOSTA SESTA to combat human trafficking. And the thing that got a little problematic there is the legislation is very punitive. It focuses on saying if you are a company that trafficking we can observe is happening, basically these companies say, okay, now there's a law, so I'm just gonna go ahead and close down maybe my ads. There was a company called Backpages that was driving a lot of profit from this. The legislation, though, basically was punitive and didn't have anything in place to say, okay, how do we take care of victims? How do we take care of people who have been trafficked? And also, how do we then, it didn't think about for people who consensually enter into sex work, where then they would go and market their services. So I think when it comes to legislation, I am weary of introducing legislation too prematurely. This entire dialogue for me is calling out a lot of things, and I think one of the best things that we can do as technologists, I only have these conversations with other people like us here. I never have these conversations in my workplace until I start having that conversation and I start saying, I'm not gonna make software that can hurt people, that can do these things, and here are my values, and here's where I stand. So I think for us as technologists, ways that we have influence and power, literally the law of 2 feet. If you are working somewhere where it's against your morale, it's against your morals, it's a conflict to you, you do not have to work there, and until you choose to stand up and say, I'm not gonna work here and create this technology, then we continue to allow these things to happen. But with the idea of then how do we inform the state to know better, to do better? Well, so some of the resources I listed, they are US specific, but there are opportunities to go meet people who are policymakers if you create that connection. So ways that I have done it is actually by going to conferences, raising these questions and finding out what's happening in my own four walls. So MIT Media Lab, for example, has a fellowship that you can go participate in. In the United States, there's programs called 18F, USDS, the United States Digital Services, that basically offer you like a 1 to 2 year contract to work in the federal sector, to be a technologist, to help think through technology strategies. I'm not sure what it looks like here in Spain or in other parts of Europe, but I imagine there's probably groups like that exist. And if this is something you are passionate about, I wish I had a better answer than to say you need to stand up and do it, but I think that's where we're at, because I don't see the leaders of organizations exactly doing that. With Facebook in particular, they are only listening now because there was so much public outcry and so much frustration and so much questioning around what happened there. The content moderation policy that I went over, their rules and policies are only changing because there are journalists that are poking at it, because there are people saying, I don't understand what's happening here. And I think for us, within the type of technology that we create and practice and use, we need to sit down, maybe do that data life cycle, understand what data you're collecting, consuming, using, find where the vulnerabilities are, go ask your organization, like, what happens when this thing happens? Are we thinking about that? Do we have things in our build cycle to allow us to think about that? Because at the end of the day, really, it's really going to be us as the subject area experts who need to surface some of these things, because until something happens, we don't really know. So my suggestion to you is continue to be critical, learn, think about things, identify those formal organizations that you can partner with, and then formal organizations like ACM are great because they are recognized as a professional industry. They're the people who you pay money to, and they've got actual professional clout, for example, in the United States. I would look for something like that to go participate in and see what they're doing. Likely that will then lead to bigger impact and bigger projects.
Well, there was a non-quick question. We're a little bit out of time, so thank you very much, Lorena, again.